Hi everyone, my name is 𝘰𝘮𝘮𝘢 and I'm a research fellow here at Emmanuel, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work. So I'm a musicologist, and broadly speaking, my work is about music in Italy in the early 20th century, roughly 1900 to 1930. And I'm especially interested in film music in Italy during this period, a period which is usually called the silent era of cinema. Now you might be thinking, hold on, how could there be music in silent cinema? And it turns out that that term is a little bit misleading. In the days before recorded sound in cinemas, films were almost always accompanied by music of some description. Music that had to be played live in the movie theater by real musicians in real time. So what's so interesting about music for so-called silent films? Well, there are several things I find particularly thought-provoking. One of those things is that film music occupies a funny position in the Italian musical landscape. It plays a part in the history of both classical and popular music. And let me explain that a little bit. At the very beginning, cinema was treated as a novelty, as a technological marvel, a fairground attraction. But as it developed, it began to muscle in on the territory of established forms of entertainment, like theater and opera. And for people in the film industry, this was great. They wanted cinema to become more respectable, and music could play a part in that by, for instance, commissioning a specially composed score for the biggest budget, elaborate productions. But for a big chunk of the middle and upper classes, cinema retained low-class associations from its fairground days, and its encroachment on respectable entertainment could only spell disaster. And as they pointed out, music in cinemas usually wasn't composed, it was patched together from fragments of famous classical pieces, popular songs, and the new, threatening sounds of jazz music. So music in lots of different ways became a focal point for arguments about whether cinema counted as art, while also being a major venue for hearing the latest hits. And this brings me to another thing about silent film music that I find compelling: how people thought about the relationship between what they saw on screen and what they heard alongside. Throughout the history of cinema, filmmakers and film musicians have used the word synchronization to describe that relationship. And now that term has a certain technical ring to it, which may make you think that synchronization was purely a matter of aligning music and images temporally. Or maybe a question of technology. And it's true, the birth of the first films with sound in the late 1920s was due to technologies that could record sounds and images together, and reproduce them at the same time. Timing is certainly part of it. But the interesting thing about synchronization is that its meaning has always been a little bit elastic, stretching to include other factors like whether the mood of the music matches the plot, or whether the cultural connotations of the music match the people or countries being depicted. In other words, good synchronization in film music is often a question of whether the music feels appropriate or inappropriate to the action. And because appropriate is a very movable goalpost, the boundaries of good synchronization in cinemas was slightly different in Italy compared to, say, the United States, even if, unsurprisingly, a lot of the strategies for getting music to fit the screen ended up converging on similar ideas in both places. So those are some of the big questions that I'm thinking about in my work, and which are at the heart of the book that I'm writing. During the lockdown, though, I've been working mainly on one small piece of this bigger project, which is an article on musicians in Italian cinemas in the 1920s. More specifically, I'm writing about why so many of these musicians, dozens and dozens of them, were bringing their employers to court. At heart, these lawsuits were all about the same thing, an employment dispute that will, I suspect, sound kind of familiar. Musicians wanted to be treated as full-time employees of the cinemas where they worked, with protections against getting fired abruptly, with sick days and pension benefits, and so on. But cinema exhibitors argued that musicians were merely independent contractors, freelancers who, needless to say, didn't have anywhere near the same legal protections. In other words, there are striking parallels between Italian film musicians in the 20s and the precarious situation of workers in today's gig economy, delivery couriers and rideshare drivers, and so on. Here's an example. Ruggero Crassa had worked for 7 years as a pianist in a cinema in Naples, when the owner fired him with just 2 weeks' notice. And even though Crassa had worked on a full-time basis exclusively in that one cinema, his employer claimed that he was just a freelancer. And after 7 years, that must have hurt. But crucially, As an employee, 𝘰𝘯 was due a pension allowance of nearly 3,000 lira, which is about £1,200 in today's money. As an independent contractor, he was due nothing. So you can see what's at stake here. 𝘰𝘯 took his ex-employer to court and he won. Of course, drawing parallels is one thing, and there are naturally many features of the case of the Italian musicians that are specific to Italy and to the 1920s. The ambiguity of Italian labor law, for instance, or the sweeping changes to the world of work introduced by Benito Mussolini's newly established fascist government. But in fact, that's a good reason for exploring these cases. We get a sense of how the fascist social revolution felt to working musicians at the sharp end of the changing policies. It's worlds away from the much more studied situation of high-profile composers like Puccini or Respighi or Malipiero and their entanglements with the regime. Here's where all this fits back into my overall project. In the absence of clear guidance from the law, the Italian musicians' lawsuits polarized the judges and legal scholars and journalists who had to confront the issue. If you thought that coordinating music to filmic images, synchronization in other words, involved some skill, and that music was an indispensable part of cinematic attraction, you were much more likely to think that musicians deserved to be treated as employees. If you felt that cinema was inherently inartistic, and its music superfluous, you were much more likely to think otherwise. So in that way, a legal dispute from 100 years ago can end up telling us quite a lot about film music and how it was perceived, and about the people that had to provide it at the time. And piecing this puzzle together has kept me sane during the lockdown, so I hope you enjoyed hearing about it. And that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.